Cory Booker took a shot on national TV, so Karoline Leavitt showed up in his city. No press, no podium, just a room full of angry parents. And that's when everything changed. Cory Booker leaned forward in his chair during a live Sunday morning segment on national television. His tone was calm, but laced with a kind of practiced superiority. When asked about Karoline Leavitt's recent remarks on federal education reform, he didn't hesitate. "She's out of her depth," he said, cracking a smile. "That kind of rhetoric might play well on social media, but it doesn't hold up in real policy rooms." The host chuckled. The panel smirked. And just like that, the clip was cut, clipped, and shared across timelines before the segment even wrapped. Within 2 hours, it was trending on X and popping up on morning newsletters. The senator from New Jersey had thrown the first punch. What he didn't expect, what none of them did, was silence. Leavitt didn't respond. Not a word. No subtweet. No press team statement. Not even a sarcastic comment on camera. The silence stretched into the evening, and by Monday morning, political commentators started speculating. Had she backed off? Was she regrouping? Did Booker's comments land harder than expected? But something else was happening behind the curtain. In a small office in Manchester, New Hampshire, Karoline sat with her staff, her elbows on the table and her laptop open. Booker's clip was muted on her screen, replaying on loop. "You hear that?" she said. "He thinks this is about Twitter. He thinks these parents are props in a headline." Her campaign manager, a lean guy in his 40s named Brendan, crossed his arms. "We can hit back hard. We've got quotes, we've got clips of him voting no when it mattered." "No," she cut him off. "We're not doing it his way." The room paused. A low buzz from the fluorescent light filled the silence. "Then what?" Brendan asked. Karoline didn't blink. "We take it to him. Not online. In person. On his turf." Brendan raised an eyebrow. "You mean, like, we fly to Newark?" There was a beat of confusion. Someone in the back let out a small laugh, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Karoline leaned back, folded her arms, and said plainly, "You want to talk policy? Let's bring receipts. Real ones. Real people." Her team moved fast. By lunchtime, she'd secured a community rec center just outside downtown Newark. A modest hall that held maybe 200 people, with folding chairs, 2 microphones, and no security detail. She didn't want a crowd. She wanted voices. That afternoon, she personally called 3 mothers from Paterson who had written her about school closures. One had a son in special education who hadn't had a consistent teacher in 11 months. Another had been leading a parents group fighting for textbook funding. The third? She'd nearly lost custody because her child had missed too many school days due to broken transportation routes. They didn't know she'd be calling. She didn't give them a speech. She just asked one question. "Can you be there?" All 3 said yes. By Tuesday morning, her team had reached out to Newark charter school teachers, district aides, even former board members who had been ignored or pushed out. The invites were discreet. No media, no big splash. Just one-on-one contact and a promise. "We're not coming to talk. We're coming to listen." By the time Booker's office caught wind of what she was planning, she was already at the airport. But what really threw them off wasn't that she was flying into New Jersey. It was who she was bringing with her. And that's where things started getting uncomfortable. Karoline Leavitt arrived at Newark Liberty Airport with little more than a carry-on, a navy blazer slung over her arm, and a look that said she hadn't come for politeness. There was no camera crew, no podium waiting, just her, Brendan, and 2 junior aides wheeling cases filled with printed testimony, binders of data, and a few handheld recorders. The rec center they booked was off Frelinghuysen Avenue, an older building wedged between a discount tire shop and an abandoned diner. The paint outside was chipped, and the chairs inside were mismatched. None of that mattered. What mattered was who was coming. By the time the folding chairs were set up in 3 uneven rows, it was already late afternoon. The aides passed out water bottles and checked the mics. Brendan was pacing. "Are we sure people are going to show up? These parents barely had 24 hours. Karoline was sitting on the edge of the stage, legs crossed, scrolling through her messages. "They'll come. When you've been ignored long enough, you don't wait for a formal invite." And they did come. At first, it was a trickle. A woman in her 50s wearing a parka, even though the air inside was warm. She introduced herself as Camille. Then 2 more arrived, one dragging a boy with a thick stack of worksheets. His name was Jordan. He didn't say much, but his eyes darted around the room like he wasn't used to adults actually paying attention. Soon, the room filled. Quietly. No fanfare. A few fathers leaned against the back wall, arms folded. Some teachers sat together, close enough to whisper between themselves, their school IDs still clipped to their shirts. Brendan approached Karoline with a whisper. "There's someone you need to meet." He motioned toward the doorway. A woman stood there, holding a reusable grocery bag and a manila folder clutched to her chest. Her hair was wrapped in a bright scarf, and her face looked tired, but clear-eyed. "This is Dr. Janice Ricks, former district policy advisor. She left the board after everything happened." Karoline walked over. No security, no entourage, just two women meeting like neighbors. "I heard about this through my niece," Dr. Ricks said. "I almost didn't come. Thought maybe it was a stunt." "It's not," Karoline said simply. "We're not here for cameras." That moment shifted the room. Quiet murmurs turned into casual greetings. A woman offered someone else a cough drop. A man scribbled notes on his hand. These weren't voters. They were people finally given space to speak. Karoline walked to the mic. "No intro speeches tonight," she said. "I didn't come to explain anything to you. I came here so you could explain it to me. Tell me what Senator Booker hasn't heard. Tell me what's been buried in the reports." The room was silent for a beat. Then Camille, the woman in the parka, stood. She spoke carefully, her voice low but steady. "My grandson gets passed from teacher to teacher because nobody stays. His reading level dropped 2 grades this year. The last time I tried to get a meeting, the office told me to try Zoom because they didn't have staff for in-person anymore." Another woman, sitting 2 rows back, lifted her hand halfway. "My daughter was an A student till they shut down after school. Now she skips class. She told me, 'Mom, what's the point?'" And just like that, the floodgates opened. A charter school teacher spoke up next. "I submitted a request for basic classroom supplies 4 times. It got bounced every time. You know what they told me? Try donors choose. Like I'm supposed to beg strangers online for pencils." Every word was being recorded, not by Karoline's team, but by the people themselves. Phones came out. Clips hit Telegram groups, local Facebook pages, even a PTA group chat that hadn't been active since spring break. But Karoline wasn't preparing for viral moments. She was preparing for something bigger. By early evening, every seat was taken. A few people stood near the exits, listening closely, arms crossed, not because they were skeptical, but because they'd learned not to get their hopes up too fast. Karoline stayed seated off to the side, her hands in her lap, not scribbling notes or checking her phone. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Then came Mr. Arnold. He was a former math teacher who'd retired early, not because he wanted to, but because, as he put it, "I was tired of lying to kids." He stood near the center aisle, a man in his 60s with faded khakis and a trembling voice. "They told us to teach to the test," he said, "so I stopped showing my students how to think. I started showing them how to pass. That's not teaching. That's training animals." A few murmurs. One woman in the front wiped her eye and looked down. He continued, "I had a kid once, Deshaun. Smart as hell. But he needed help, someone to push him. When they cut his tutoring and canceled his bus route, he disappeared. I never saw him again. I don't even know if he's alive." Silence. Karoline's eyes never left him. From the back row, someone whispered, "This ain't the stuff they bring up in D.C., huh?" Then a mother, Sharonda, stood, holding up a printed letter. "I brought this from East Side Middle School. It's what they gave us when we asked about mental health support after a student attempted suicide in the bathroom. You know what it says? We are evaluating our protocols and reviewing capacity. That's it." She shook the paper like it had personally insulted her. "That was 4 months ago. My son still doesn't sleep right." Brendan shifted uncomfortably against the wall. He'd worked campaigns before. He'd seen plenty of town halls, but never like this. These weren't talking points being exchanged. They were confessions. Unfiltered grief, frustration, guilt. One teacher, Mr. DeSantis, got up and hesitated before speaking. "I almost didn't come," he said, "because I knew it'd just make me mad again. But I had to. I watched kids sharing torn-up books with pages missing. I begged for heaters when our classroom dropped to 53 degrees. And do you know what the district told me?" He looked around. "They said we didn't make the list of critical needs." A soft laugh, half disbelief, half despair, rippled through the crowd. Karoline finally stood, not to take the spotlight, but to address the room directly. "Does anyone know if Senator Booker's team ever held a forum like this here?" she asked. No one answered, not because they didn't know, because they knew the answer. She paused. "I don't need to be right. I just need to make sure people like you stop being wronged." Then someone pulled out a phone. Not a staffer, not a reporter, just a woman in the back with a cracked iPhone who started filming. She didn't say anything. She just hit record, pointed it toward the front, and let it roll. That's the clip that would explode later. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was raw. Because in a country where everything sounds polished, edited, and packaged, this wasn't. In the video, you see Karoline listening, arms folded. You hear Sharonda's voice crack. You see Mr. Arnold holding back tears as he talks about a student he still dreams about. No slogans, no podiums, no applause lines. Just people, talking like someone was finally listening. And that hit different. But the silence from Booker's team after this? That hit harder. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that Senator Booker's office issued a statement. By then, the clip from the Newark town hall had already spread beyond local circles. It had bounced from Facebook to YouTube to morning talk radio in cities like Cincinnati, Phoenix, and even Spokane. A 5-minute video of people venting frustrations had done what campaign ads and speeches never could. It struck a nerve. The official response from Booker's team came in the form of a carefully worded press release. It thanked community members for raising their concerns and promised that the senator was working diligently on bipartisan solutions for our education system. He proposed a roundtable to be held in 2 weeks at a nearby university, but it was too polished, too slow, too late. No names, no direct acknowledgement of the forum Karoline had held just miles from his home office. No reference to the teachers, the mothers, or Mr. Arnold's broken voice. It read like a generic form letter sent after a customer complaint, and people noticed. Even some of Booker's longtime supporters raised eyebrows. In group chats and on local AM radio, the mood shifted, not toward outrage, but toward disappointment. You could hear it in their tone. "He should have been there first," someone said on a call-in show based in Edison. "You don't wait till someone else shows up to care." On Twitter, a retired Newark teacher named Lorraine, who rarely posted, wrote, "I've voted for Booker every year since I was 25, but I've never seen him listen like Leavitt did." That one got over 20,000 likes in 2 days. Inside Booker's office, the scramble began. Meetings were called. Communications aides debated whether to follow up with a video of the senator visiting a school, maybe a photo op with students. But none of it felt right. Because now, any move he made would look like what it was. Reactionary. "Should we push back?" one aide asked during a strategy call. "Frame this as a political ambush?" But the response from the team was quiet. They all knew something had shifted. Because while Booker was calculating his optics, Leavitt was already en route to Trenton. Not for a press stunt, not for cameras, but for a private meeting with state education board members. She walked into the building with a red folder filled with transcripts from the town hall, and she left with a promise to forward the reports to subcommittees. Word spread quickly, and then came the second blow. A local columnist named Antonio Reese, usually a moderate voice, published an opinion piece in the Newark Times titled "Presence Matters More Than Promises." It wasn't aggressive, but it cut deep. He wrote, "Senator Booker has long spoken about dignity, but dignity isn't words. It's action. When a room full of your constituents cried out for help, they were met with silence. Not because you don't care, but because you weren't there." The next day, someone leaked an internal email from Booker's education staff. It showed that they'd been alerted about declining teacher retention and bus route gaps 6 months ago. No response was ever issued to that report. The email wasn't scandalous. It wasn't criminal. But it painted a picture of a team too slow to act, too insulated to adapt. The kind of political complacency that breeds resentment, not hatred, just quiet, bitter fatigue. Meanwhile, Karoline wasn't gloating. She hadn't posted victory messages or fiery takedowns. She kept doing meetings, visiting school boards in nearby cities like Elizabeth and Bayonne, shaking hands with exhausted teachers who looked at her not as a savior, but as someone who didn't flinch when things got uncomfortable. And that mattered more than any viral moment. But what came next wasn't going to be quiet. It was going to be public and live. Behind closed doors, Senator Booker's inner circle was cracking. What started as a minor PR issue had evolved into a full-blown credibility crisis. The emails didn't help, but what truly rattled Booker's team was the silence from his usual allies. State officials who would normally jump to his defense were keeping their heads down. Some were even distancing themselves. In a quiet hallway at the state capitol in Trenton, one of Booker's longtime political allies, Assemblywoman Clarice Denman, spoke to a reporter off the record. "I don't know why Cory waited," she said. "We all knew those issues were there. The parents were loud. The teachers were louder. Maybe he thought it would blow over." It didn't. The real gut punch came 2 days later when a former advisor, Daniel Ibarra, posted a thread on X that went viral. Ibarra had worked for Booker during his mayoral run and into his first Senate term. He wasn't known for theatrics, but his words hit hard. "I sat in meetings where public school closures were discussed like logistics. No emotion, just cost sheets and re-election maps. When I spoke up about community pushback, I was told, they'll come around." 10 years later, they didn't come around. They gave up, or moved, or got ignored again. What Karoline Leavitt did in that room wasn't political, it was overdue. That thread had over 40,000 shares in 24 hours. Reporters picked it up. Sunday talk shows quoted it. And Booker, he still hadn't gone on camera. Inside his campaign headquarters, the mood was tense. Staffers were re-watching the Newark town hall footage frame by frame, trying to spot weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything they could latch onto to regain control of the narrative. But there was nothing to spin. Everything was real. The trembling hands, the stained paper handouts, the tired parents in folding chairs. Brendan, back in New Hampshire, noticed the shift too. He was scrolling through the comments on a video of Karoline's Bayonne meeting when he muttered, "This isn't just a press win, it's a mood shift." He wasn't wrong. What made it worse for Booker was that the pressure wasn't just coming from the outside. Internally, several younger aides were pushing for a full apology. Not the crafted kind, but something that sounded human. Reluctantly, a video was drafted, Booker seated behind a desk, speaking plainly, trying to address the anger. But the test run didn't land. "It sounds like he's reading," one aide said. "No, it looks like he's reading." Another shook her head. "This just makes her look stronger." Meanwhile, Karoline's team wasn't waiting. They had already begun scheduling more events. No national press, just local stops. Paterson, Orange, Irvington. They knew the impact wasn't about headlines. It was about repetition, showing up again, and again, and again. That strategy began bleeding into national perception. By the weekend, independent voters in Pennsylvania and Ohio were discussing her name in casual conversation, not because of what she said, but because she listened. That's when the Democratic strategist Elaine Winters appeared on a podcast and said something that rippled through D.C. If your enemy is connecting emotionally and all you're doing is rebutting factually, you've already lost. For Booker, the worst was still ahead, because someone had booked a neutral stage, a live debate, and both camps had been invited. Trenton, New Jersey, broadcast across 6 networks. 45 minutes, no commercials. Karoline's team accepted within 5 minutes. Booker's staff took nearly 3 hours to say yes. But by the time they confirmed, the audience had already picked their favorite, and it wasn't the one with the longer resume. Trenton's Civic Auditorium hadn't seen this kind of energy in years. Built back in the 60s, the place still had mustard-colored walls and a row of squeaky wooden seats in the middle section. But that night, it was packed. Standing room only. Local teachers, union reps, college students, single moms, dads in work boots. They all came. Not to see a polished debate, but to watch something real. There were no fancy graphics or dramatic music, just 2 lecterns, 2 candidates, and a moderator trying to look like he had control over what was about to happen. Karoline walked onto the stage wearing a simple navy pantsuit. No frills, hair tied back. She looked like someone who had something to prove, but nothing to lose. Booker came out moments later in his usual tailored suit and striped tie. He smiled at the audience, but it wasn't the same smile he gave during campaign stops. It looked like he wasn't sure if this crowd was with him or against him. They weren't rude, but they weren't warm either. The moderator opened the debate with a predictable question about federal education spending. Booker started first. He was smooth, articulate, detailed. He listed his accomplishments, grants approved, committees joined, meetings held. Karoline waited patiently. When it was her turn, she didn't go after his record, not directly. Instead, she reached into a folder and pulled out a photocopied letter. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a letter from a mother in Newark. She asked 3 times for her son to be evaluated for learning difficulties. No response, no appointment, nothing." She placed it on the lectern. Her son now reads at a 3rd grade level, in 6th grade. The crowd was dead silent. Booker cleared his throat. "There are systemic," Karoline cut in, not aggressively, but just enough. "With respect, Senator, I don't think she cares about systems anymore. She just wants her kid to learn." That was the tone for the rest of the debate. Booker spoke about federal frameworks, bipartisan barriers, and the need for sustainable infrastructure. It was solid, technically correct, but it floated. Karoline kept bringing it back down. Names, faces, notes she'd taken from Newark, from Bayonne, from Camden. Each time Booker tried to pivot, she pulled him back. "You had 10 years, she said calmly, and yet a teacher in Patterson had to use GoFundMe for whiteboards. He tried to challenge her numbers. She offered to connect him with the teacher herself. By the halfway mark, the moderator stopped trying to interject. He let them go. Because what was happening didn't feel like a debate. It felt like a reckoning. Then came the final question. "What's one thing you regret in how you've handled education policy?" Karoline answered first. "I regret thinking the data would speak for itself," she said. "I used to believe that if the numbers were strong, people would feel heard. But I was wrong. People don't care about charts. They care about being seen." Then Booker took a breath. His eyes drifted toward the crowd, then back to the floor. "I regret not showing up sooner." It was quiet for a moment, genuine maybe, but also too late. The debate ended without fireworks, no knockout blow. But when the candidates walked off stage, it was clear which one had shifted the ground beneath them. Outside, local news reporters asked attendees who they thought came out on top. One woman, a school counselor from Elizabeth, shrugged and said, "Booker had facts. She had people, and people matter more right now." But what came next proved this wasn't just a debate. This was a signal. And across the country, others had been watching. The debate had barely ended when the ripples started spreading. Clips flooded the internet, but this time it wasn't just pundits or influencers reposting. Teachers were sharing the exchange about the GoFundMe whiteboards. Parents were quoting the line, "People don't care about charts, they care about being seen." It was showing up on bumper stickers by the weekend. Karoline flew back to New Hampshire the next morning, but something had changed. She wasn't treated like a firebrand anymore. She was being asked for advice by school boards in Scranton, Lansing, and Tulsa. Her inbox filled with requests for visits, not from political organizers, but from librarians, substitute teachers, and PTA chairs. She didn't respond to all of them right away. She wasn't trying to build a movement. She was trying to keep a promise. In Concord, she met with 2 superintendents who had quietly driven over from Massachusetts just to talk. One of them pulled out a faded binder of budget denials dating back 5 years. "No one's looked at this," he said, "because we don't make noise." Karoline didn't nod. She opened the binder and started flipping pages. Back in New Jersey, things were different too. Booker wasn't gone. He wasn't canceled. But he was quieter, more careful. He started attending school board meetings without announcing it to the press. He sat in the back. He asked for notes instead of making speeches. Some said he was trying to save face. Others said he was finally listening. Either way, the noise around him faded, replaced by something harder to manage: expectation. Nationally, the conversation had shifted. Not just about Booker, about all of them. Politicians who'd gotten too used to phone-in appearances and weekend soundbites were being compared directly to what Leavitt had done. Reporters stopped asking, "What are your policies?" and started asking, "When's the last time you were in a room full of teachers without cameras?" Karoline kept her schedule quiet. No stadiums, no rallies. Just a stream of visits to places where the cafeteria clock didn't work and half the lockers had no doors. She brought nothing with her but a notebook and time. At one school in Dayton, Ohio, a janitor asked her, "Why are you even here? Nobody votes in midterms around here." She smiled and said, "I'm not here for November. I'm here for Tuesday." He didn't say anything, but he stayed behind and cleaned a little slower than usual, just close enough to hear. The impact wasn't immediate, but it was building. By spring, a dozen local candidates from both sides of the aisle started holding their own quiet town halls. No press, just chairs and people. Some flopped, some fizzled, but some caught fire. A teacher in Missouri who had never run for anything won a school board seat by 12 votes after showing video of her third-grade students doing homework with crayons because the school ran out of pens. The movement had no name, no logo, just a pattern. Show up, shut up, listen. Karoline never took credit for any of it. When asked, she said, "They were already speaking. I just didn't bring a microphone." And the lesson was clear. Politics didn't need more drama. It needed more chairs, more people in rooms with no promises of solutions. Just a chance to be heard. It didn't erase the damage. It didn't fix every budget. But it did something even more powerful. It made silence uncomfortable. And once that happens, the real change usually starts. So, if you're watching this and you've been waiting for someone to speak for you, maybe it's time to start talking. And maybe someone will finally listen. Subscribe for more real stories that matter. We're not here to shout louder. We're here to hear louder.